Hi, it's Kai, and this is Un-American. In Un-American, I invite international experts to share their perspectives on US-related issues and to add new angles to inherently American debates. Today, this podcast goes transatlantic as I speak with Oxford professor Jane Gingrich in the UK and philosopher Nancy Fraser in New York. Our focus? The failure of the center-left and the future of the Democratic Party. Nancy Fraser and Jane Gingrich, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, good to be here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
First of all, I want to thank both of you because this is the first podcast that I'm recording since the elections. And I feel like this is a bit of a self-made support group for me in a way. I feel like I'm still in a slightly fragile emotional state, I would say. At the same time, I feel more collected than I felt in 2016 in a way. And that also leads right into my first question. How are both of you feeling? Are you upset? Are you, like me, maybe upset that you can't even be upset anymore? Are you feeling something else entirely? And I want to start with you, Jane. You're coming to us from the UK, and that's at least geographically slightly removed from all of this mess. So how are you feeling?
I guess, watching the Biden administration, I think that there was a number of really positive policies that they pursued. Some weren't successful, but some actually moved the dial in, I think, ways that were interesting and important, sort of on labor rights, on antitrust, on industrial policy. And there were some, I think, positive gains to those policies. And so just at the moment of leading up to the election, it felt, okay, this is the left trying something somewhat new. And let's see, it didn't seem to be sort of sinking in. And so there wasn't a lot of shock in the way that the election results went, but there was certainly some disappointment that some of the policies that I think were pushing in the right direction didn't seem to pay off. And then thinking about it from the UK context, there's a question of what this means then for labor here, where they're facing a lot of the same kind of trade-offs in terms of their approaches.
How about you, Nancy?
Well, I have a very single dominant emotion, and it's anger and fury at the Democratic Party for making the same mistake twice, running a campaign that was basically organized and insisting on a candidate who was basically identified with what I've called progressive neoliberalism. This is exactly the wrong way to fight whatever you want to call Trump, reactionary populism, proto-fascism. I mean, we can argue about the name, but whatever it is, you cannot beat it by, let's say, stressing, centering a campaign on how bad Trump is, not actually emphasizing how bad things are for the majority of people, the deterioration of living conditions, including the environment. If anybody had any doubts, the extreme weather that we're experiencing now have been the wake-up call for those late sleepers on this issue, let's say. So, I mean, I just don't know how you can keep making the same mistake over and over and over again. And I would say that the key in all three elections, even, of course, you could say, yes, Biden won, and yes, he did some okay things. But basically, for three elections, the party establishment has muscled out any possibility of a left pro-working class progressive candidate or campaign. They did that in 2016, muscling Sanders out. They did it again, installing Biden in 2020 when Sanders was really winning every primary. And now again with the very late withdrawal by Biden, leaving no opportunity for any kind of actual contest between the various wings of the parties. So I guess for me, the question is, does the Democratic Party have a future after this? How many times can they make the same mistake? Are some people going to get fed up and not just vote for Trump, but split and found a new party? I don't know where we're going, but it does seem to me that this is some kind of a big hinge point. I don't think, by the way, it's a durable realignment. Trump's coalition won in a convincing way, I have to say. I don't think that's an actual durable realignment. But what happens on the other side, for me, is the pressing question. And as I say, I'm in a rage about it.
This is going to be an easy interview for me because Nancy's already asking herself all the questions that I want to ask her. So let's go through it one by one. I mean, noted anger and not a lot of shock at the same time. But what we're listening to right now, what we're hearing right now is a lot of grasping with this new reality. I think we're pretty clear on what a Trump victory might mean for the future of the US and for the world in general. It's also a message that the Democrats have repeatedly hammered into our heads in their campaign. A descent into fascism in the US, the end of democracy, a victory for Russia and Ukraine, maybe climate catastrophe. You've listed some of them already, Nancy. However, I do want to focus on the question that you have raised. I want to focus on the Democrats because, I mean, I couldn't be any more disappointed by the Republicans, that's for sure, but that's also to be expected. But I am also, just like you, Nancy, constantly surprised how underwhelmed I can be by the Democrats each time an election comes around. And I don't even want to put that on the people who have worked their asses off for the Harris campaign, because I do think they had an uphill battle to fight, but it's more to me about the greater party and its strategy. I'm going to ask you, Nancy, a question that is in court probably considered a leading question. Just watching the Democrats getting another chance this year at defeating Donald Trump, what annoyed you the most about how they tried to do it?
Well, I guess the first thing I already alluded to was the sort of coronation of Kamala Harris. I mean, Biden staying in as long as he did, and then essentially anointing her so that the Democratic Party is much less democratic than the Republican Party in terms of its internal operations. I mean, if you go back to 2016, the Democratic leadership, as I said before, muscled Sanders out and installed Clinton. The Republicans actually let the insurgent win and be their candidate. And then there was the campaign that Harris actually won. And, you know, she had some real strengths. I think better than any US female politician that I've seen. She actually sort of solved the riddle of how to be strong and tough and warm and feminine at the same time, which, you know, famously Hillary Clinton couldn't figure out. So, you know, she had stuff going for her, that radiant smile and so on and so forth. But the vacuity, apart from abortion rights, where you could see the real passion, the absolute vacuity, these phrases repeated endlessly, opportunity economy with, you know, zero content. It was, and her inability to actually show any non-formulaic, non-scripted understanding of why people might be angry, why they might be turning to Trump, her total inability to articulate a counter explanation of why things are so deteriorated now. You know, I mean, Trump at least has a narrative about that. It's a completely false and erroneous narrative about who's to blame, you know, the immigrants who are eating our dogs and cats and so on. But she had no narrative at all. And so she was a singularly weak candidate, despite some things that you might think on the surface what she had going for her. I can't say that a more robustly left candidate of the sort that I was hoping for, I can't say for sure that that person would have beaten Trump. But even if that person had not beaten Trump, the party would be in such a better state to, you know, articulate and develop a perspective. And now it just stands for bi-coastal elites suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. That's the whole party.
Jane, I'm going to ask you something similar. You've written about the decline of social democracy in Europe and the crisis of the left in Europe, and also what meaningful lessons they could have drawn from their defeats against moderate conservatives in the past and against far-right populists. What stood out to you watching the US election regarding the Democratic strategy to counter Trump? And what parallels do you see between the failure of the US Democrats in this election and the failure of many center-left parties in Europe in the recent past?
Yeah, so I think I agree with a lot of what Nancy just said in the sense of that the messaging was really lacking in a way that was compelling. I think that maybe I'm a little more sympathetic to the Biden administration. As I said at the beginning, I think they did actually move the dial on policy in ways that were relatively surprising and did try to pick up some more sort of economic rhetoric that might have connected in a different environment with voters. But I think where I really agree with Nancy, and I think it's a broader problem with center-left parties across all Western democracies, is that they haven't really offered an alternative vision for the economy or for society that allows people to understand a social democratic or left project. And so there is a kind of a competition that's emerged that's either in many contexts, it's just on competence. It's on we can manage the economy a little bit better. Maybe we're a tiny bit more egalitarian, but there's not much of a sort of a vision of how to make things work better for people. And then if people are in an environment where they're consuming very different kinds of media, where their lives don't feel meaningfully changed by policy, then this rhetoric of competence or of like we can deliver things a little bit better just doesn't cut through. And there's many good reasons why it probably shouldn't cut through. And as a result, when you have a vision that is quite clear and legible to people, and the Trumpian kind of vision, people really understood sort of the core components of that. So it's a messy and terrible vision in many ways, but the two kinds of things he really pushed on in terms of immigration, and then also this kind of language of economic decline and so on, that really cut through and people understood what that meant. And they also saw some possibility for change in that. And I think the center left has been extremely ineffective at coming up with some version of a progressive version of that, where people can say, we know where things are going, and there is a vision there that is inspiring and that could, in fact, deliver some kind of change. And I agree with the point Nancy made right at the end that who knows if a candidate that ran to the left of Trump would have won in this particular election. I think the cards were stacked against the victory in a whole variety of ways. But there is the possibility, if we think about a medium run strategy of building back a brand, an identity, a vision that more people could identify with, that does require something that breaks with the way that the sort of politics as normal kind of the last years. And I think that's where center-left parties pretty much universally have struggled.
So both of what you said, very interesting. So many points that I'm going to get into that you've already mentioned. One of the points that is just striking to me to start this off and to really get into the heads of Democrats themselves, to me, is one point that Nancy and you mentioned. Why can't you just say that, yes, we passed some good policy in the Biden administration, but also acknowledge that pain that exists at the same time? I will never understand why that is not possible. And you also saw it in the post-election debate on what went wrong. Take Nancy Pelosi, for example, who went to talk to the New York Times, and she was asked what the Democrats could have done differently. And what she came up with in 40 minutes of an interview was the following.
I would have wished that they had, in the first 2 years of the president's term, been more out there about what we had accomplished. The rescue package, money in people's pockets, shots in their arms, people back to work, children safely back to school, the Biden child tax credit, all those things. There could have been more presentation of that.
Let me repeat that in my own words. What she's essentially saying to people is, we got all the policies right, we just didn't do enough to tell people about how great they are. Nancy, I feel it might be redundant to ask you whether you believe this, but do you think Pelosi actually believes it herself?
I'm not sure. She certainly has a personal investment in wanting credit for all that because she's responsible for anything good that came out of it. She's kind of a brilliant parliamentarian tactician. But what I remember even more striking in the interviews and so on that she's gained is her fury at Bernie Sanders. How dare he say that the party has abandoned the working class when we did X, Y, and Z. So her defense of all of this has a defensive quality. It's defending against the left. And I think that's been very, very central in the whole Democratic Party operation.
Let me jump into Bernie Sanders then immediately, because this is the next question. Bernie Sanders, very different reaction to the election. You just quoted him. I'm going to give you the full quote. He said, "It should come as no great surprise that a Democratic Party which has abandoned working class people would find that the working class has abandoned them." And he also said, by the way, in a second sentence that has been quoted less often, "While the Democratic leadership defends the status quo, the American people are angry and want change."
The reality is the American people, well, many of them, are angry, and they have every reason to be angry. Today in America, and sometimes some of the elite does not understand this, today in America, 60% of our people are living paycheck to paycheck. It means that if your car breaks down, you don't know how you get to work. If you get sick, you don't know whether or not you can afford to go to a doctor. If your landlord raises rent by 20%, you don't know where you're going to live, where your kid is going to go to school. That's the reality facing 60% of the American people. Meanwhile, the very wealthiest people in this country have never, ever had it so good. That's a reality. So what happened in this campaign is Donald Trump said to the American people, "You're angry. You're really pissed off. And I know that. And you're right." And then he gave his explanation. And his explanation, which was obviously nonsense and false and racist, etc., was that millions and millions of undocumented people were coming across the border. They were invading America. We're an occupied country. They were taking your jobs, taking your benefits, eating your cats and your dogs. That is why you are hurting. Now, that is a crazy explanation, but it is an explanation. Now, you tell me what the Democratic explanation was.
I'll pass that question on to you, Nancy. Do you believe that Democrats really, truly understand the frustration that exists within America? And I'm not only going to put it on the working class, because I feel people do that all the time. I feel a general frustration in the US with what things are like right now.
The first thing to say is that I agree 100% with these quotes from Sanders. I think that he's got that absolutely right, that there is tremendous anger. It's very widespread. We could quibble over how we should understand the phrase "the working class," because I don't think it's just white guys in factories. I think it's immigrants, people of color, low-wage service workers, caregivers, housewives. I mean, we're all working. But the key is this question of those who don't have any accumulated wealth to fall back on and are in a Sisyphean way working for the next week's food, week after week after week. So I think he's completely right about that. And I would say, going back to Jane's earlier points, I think whatever was good that Biden did, and you're right, there were some good things, this all came from Sanders. Biden took office without a clue as to what he wanted to do with the presidency. And in return, I guess there was some kind of deal in return for Bernie's full-throated support in the 2020 campaign. He sort of adopted the program that Sanders had. And, so I give Sanders a tremendous amount of credit, but I want to be clear that I don't idealize him either, because he too has had very little to say about immigration. He too is more focused on redistribution than on restructuring, and redistribution without restructuring is highly problematic. So, I just want to be very clear. I'm not just saying Sanders is the last word in all of this, but that diagnosis of the mood of the country. And the other thing is that the big dividing line between the two parties is now education. A college education versus those without a college education. And that is not a bad proxy for working class. Although I think a very full-throated pro-working class, pro-working family perspective would win a lot of middle-class professional people as well. I don't think it's just, literally manual workers or whatever. So yeah, I think he had it right. And Trump, the last point is that the irony is that Trump got the language from Sanders. Sanders campaigned in 2016 on the rigged economy, the rigged system. Trump understood the power of that word and appropriated it and made it his own and, developed it in a way that was very powerful. The other thing is that Bernie radiates a kind of conviction and authenticity. It's a very different kind of authenticity than Trump's. And that's what Harris could not summon.
I have a question for you there, because it's just something that I feel very strongly when I listen to Harris speak. Do you think that is because there's just a lack of conviction, really? Because, I mean, you could argue she went to Pennsylvania, said fracking is not that bad, went back, said fracking is the worst thing that can happen to us, changed her positions on all kinds of things. But I don't think that matters that much if you, like you say, if somebody asks you a question and you have a conviction, then you will answer a certain way. And I feel like people can easily sense when there is nothing to hold on to, really, but just like, how can I answer this question in the politically most beneficial way? Is that something that you saw with Harris, or what's the reason for being so flimsy on these questions?
I did see that in Harris, and it's almost as you can see the wheels turning as she's talking, figuring out how to maneuver. So it's exactly the wrong picture that you want to give. And I mean, you can just simply say, I changed my mind and here's why. And then give the argument for the position you want to defend now. It's not so difficult to do that. The other thing is, I think Trump really demands that. His, let's call it libidinal looseness, his just kind of a once-in-a-lifetime genius kind of politician, in a way. His ability to crack jokes, to be humorous, to be loose, to make asides. Next to that, this overly scripted, calculating, cautious, he threw her weaknesses into relief by his own looseness, so to speak.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, and also what I was witnessing during the campaign pretty much. Jane, in a way, I feel like also what we're witnessing and what we've seen with the Democrats in the US, it really reminds me of Europe. It reminds me of this phase of the Brexit, like leading up to the Brexit. It reminds me of the so-called, I don't like that word, migrant crisis of 2015 in Germany. In each of those cases, I feel like a substantial amount of people in Germany, in Britain, really voiced that they were unhappy with how the country was run, with what politics was doing. And in each of those cases, the center-left, in Germany, the Volkspartei and the big popular parties, told the people, well, you don't really know what you're talking about. And, well, maybe you're racist, And while that might even be true in many cases, I feel like it's also a sort of instrument for the center-left to not really look in the mirror and be like, are we part of this whole mess, or are we just looking onto it as a bystander? Especially because I feel that in many of these things, the left is trying to be so rational about these things. Like, if I'm in a relationship with somebody and I voice a frustration and I say, you did do the dishes again, or anything that I would voice to my partner might just be an expression of something else, something that I'm frustrated, that I feel vulnerable. It doesn't have to be the dishes. It doesn't have to be the border. It doesn't have to be the migrants. It can be just an expression of things are not well and I'm feeling vulnerable. And that is something that recently has been voiced by Kansas-based journalist Sarah Smarsh, who writes about the white working class a lot and economic inequality in the US. And she pointed out recently the following.
Most people are hurting. And here's the thing, because I know that a lot of liberals and Democrats and progressives alike might be saying, but you're saying all that, and the Democrats have the better policies. They address all of those needs better, even if imperfectly. Ain't the Republicans worse? And while I happen to agree with that, here's the trick. The Republicans, meanwhile, are the ones validating the pain. And politics is an emotional business before it's a rational one. And that's why they win.
Jane, why are right-wing populists, not only in the US, but also in Europe, so much better at understanding this dynamic?
It's a good question. I think there's probably three linked reasons, and that your question is pointing to them. So the first is the structure of the parties themselves and the kind of way that they're recruiting new politicians and generating talent and so on. And for a long time, the party structures of kind of the mainstream left have been closed off, controlled. They've become increasingly descriptively of the working class. So they've really struggled to recruit working class candidates. And again, building on the very broad definition of the working class to include care workers, all sorts of different kinds of workers. They've really struggled with that. And so you end up with a kind of more elite cadre of politicians that are often pretty raised up within and have done well within the contemporary structure, and there's been a sort of lack of these kind of generational politicians that have been able to really connect with people. They do exist, and there's some that are really excellent out there, but I think that's been something that many center-left parties have really struggled with. They've become very professionalized in ways that have cut them off from some of the constituents that they historically represented. I think a second thing is, and this is maybe a slightly more sympathetic read than the conversation we've been having so far, is that they are parties that care about the state. If you think that governments are fundamentally important to shaping collective well-being, towards shaping a better, more progressive future, then you actually do care about managing the state competently in particular ways. And I know that in the UK, this is really something that the Labour Party feels very intensely. If they can't deliver on improving the NHS, or they can't deliver on improving schools, public services, and so on, then they're really going to lose the battle entirely, because they've staked a lot on that, but also that they feel like in some ways the legitimacy of the state with trust that's really record lows is at threat. And that kind of pushes them into this kind of competence politics that's very hard to break out of. And then the third, I think, is that the far right in particular, for reasons that I don't entirely understand, has just been much savvier and more adept at using new forms of social media, at connecting increasingly with young people. So the recent data that I've seen suggests that a growing share of not just young people in general are willing to consider voting for the far right, but even young people with a college degree in Europe. So that's a real shift from older generations. And so there's been, I think, again, probably a linkage of the center left into more traditional forms of media and communication that haven't been able to reach out to people that have been that are either young or they're frustrated with politics. And all those three things together, when you add them up, a competence-focused politics, a very traditional style of professional politician, and an inability to really communicate to people in new ways, that pushes the center left into a much more kind of rational technocratic politics that then can be very much outcompeted by parties or actors or that are offering something different and really do have that kind of authenticity, even if it's completely manufactured in terms of offering it.
Thank you so much for making that point. I do think that's a very potent point and a good point. And I'm also really don't want to suggest that I feel like Democrats are doing this for all the wrong reasons. I do think a lot of progressives and Democrats, center-left people are losing with the best intentions. Maybe we can call it. I still want to get into how the center-left talks to people and how it addresses the people that they want to vote for them in the end. In the US, I feel like this came through again in this election. It wasn't as bad as the 2016 Trump voters are deplorables style that they chose back then. But in a way, what was going on reminded me of this workshop that I had at work once at one of my old jobs. People in that organization that I worked for had a very bad year. There was people being fired. There was a lot of change happening around them, and they were very unhappy. But in the same year, the organization had actually gotten pretty successful and had grown a lot, which was also causing a lot of that change within the organization. And then towards the end of the year, we were all invited to this workshop. And the workshop was how to come up with this grand future vision for the organization. Great workshop, in my opinion. Horrible timing for the people working in the organization. Because when the CEO came in and she was really bustling with ideas, she was very happy to be there and thought that she'd done this great thing. There was a huge argument. And one of my colleagues in that argument said a sentence to the CEO that I will never forget because it was really striking. She said, "We are all on board of a burning ship. And right now you are asking us to have a meeting to talk about how great this ship will be in the future." Nancy, is that what many people might be feeling like when the Democrats talk to them? When they feel like, I can't pay for my groceries, but the Democrats are telling me that GDP is up?
Yeah, I think that is a very powerful quote, and it does capture something about this situation. I guess that I would say, first of all, I mean, I like Jane's point that you just stressed about the sort of professionalization of the political party and class, and this sense of a gulf that they're talking one language, technical managerial language, and that there's a huge gulf in communication. The interesting thing is why in the US, the Republican Party doesn't have that same situation. They're equally professionalized, but they actually had a real insurgency, which they did not suppress, but allowed to flower. And so things are much looser now. There's much less of a gulf, at least in public. What goes on behind closed doors, it might be another issue. The other thing I want to say is this idea that we're the rational ones and they're the irrational ones. This is simply false. The Democrats are just as irrational in a different way, precisely as your colleague said, because they want to talk about how great the ship is going to be while it's burning. That there's nothing more irrational than that. And then your point about how they, I would say that even though that word deplorables was not sort of explicitly in the mix, something about the attitude, the condescension. And it has to do with, look how irrational these people are. Look how screwed up they are. Look at all the crazy things they believe. Look how they use the word weird they are, right? So that it's not taking them seriously as interlocutors. They're not trying to woo them. They're not trying to say, here's why you're feeling this. It's you're as you said, validating the grievance, the anger. Your feelings make a lot of sense, but here's a better story about how we got to this point, who's to blame, and how we should think about changing things than the one that Trump gives. Instead, Obama made this mistake way back when, in 2008. He's talked about how they cling to their religion and their guns. Remember that? That was talking about them like you're a sociologist when you actually are trying to get their votes. Not a good communication strategy. So why don't they validate the pain? They don't feel it. They don't feel it. Somehow the Republicans have enough people, kind of in the mix that the feelings transmit back and forth. And they don't on the Democratic side.
Jane, let's still move on a little bit and get the conversation a bit away from the diagnosis that we've had so far and into the territory of solutions. And I also don't simply want to look at it through this whole disenfranchisement working class lens. You have argued in the past that the decline of the center left in Europe is in fact not simply a result of losing votes of blue-collar voters, but also of an increasing number of highly educated voters turning their backs on them. And you conclude in an article that you've written for The Guardian that the Social Democrats need to ask themselves how they can build new electoral coalitions. First of all, how did you get to that conclusion? Because that article was written a while ago, I think in 2021. And then what could those new electoral coalitions look like, in your opinion?
Yeah, so this comes from some work we've done, and I think it's a little bit different in the European context to either Britain or the US, in part because of the nature of the proportional electoral system. In Europe, in most European democracies, political parties can lose voters in both directions, right? So there's parties to the left of them and there's parties to the right of them. And so one of the kind of tropes that was very dominant in the sort of late 2010s was that moving to the left had caused all the working class voters to move to the right, and that this was what really put Social Democrats in trouble. And I think what the data were telling us, this is with my colleague Tarek Aberchadi, is that actually, no, they were often losing also voters to the left. So that there's movements in both directions. And it's not just a story of kind of, the Social Democrats became too woke or they were too neoliberal, that there's actually like some real tensions there. They're losing voters in many different directions. The problem with that is that it leaves a very fragmented political space. And so it's a different world than the two-party system in the US, where all of these kind of cleavages overlay onto just two political parties. So in the European context, you have green parties, which really are the parties of more highly educated urban voters. You have more radical left parties that are often mixing, a range of different kinds of voters, but are often quite urban as well. And then you have center-right parties that are picking up the usual people that kind of move from election to election. And so social democrats are caught in between those things, and their decline is really causes of a decline in these cross-class coalitions within political parties because different groups are fragmenting in so many different directions. So the question then is like, how can you build these coalitions back together in a way that is stable? Because the working class is much more diverse than it was in the past. The movements that feed into the working class are much more diverse. And so you have as many or more care workers than metal workers in many contexts. And so you've got to think about how to pull these groups together and build a more sustainable coalition. And I think educated professionals are going to be part of that. They vote for the left. They're fairly reliable. And so the choice isn't between moving from one sort of social group to another, but it is about trying to think about how to pull those groups together. The mistake I think that social democrats made, and I think this echoes something that Nancy was saying a few moments ago, is that they tended to pursue both the rhetoric and policy prescriptions of the more educated parts of that coalition. And we know that when we look at data on voters' preferences, that actually what educated professionals who vote for the left really are programs like education, things that kind of make work pay, those types of programs. Whereas working class voters, again, broadly defined to include lots of different types of workers, want things like more higher minimum wages, restrictions on exploitative working conditions, the kind of more traditional progressive demands. And they also want really secure income guarantees around pensions and unemployment and things that can make their lives more secure. And often those policies were ignored in favor of these kinds of social investments in education, and which are good. They're good policies, but they didn't reflect the real concerns of that part of the constituency. And so what you end up with is an attempt to pull these two groups together, but where one group has a lot more say over the kind of rhetoric and policy apparatus. And that leaves the coalition very vulnerable.
Over the past few months, and this feeds into what Jane has just said about the center-left in Europe and the center-left in general, I've really been grappling with where I think personally the Democratic Party should go from here. And that goes more into solutions territory now. And I've talked to a lot of people about what I think. And when I share my view that I do think Democrats need to stand for something meaningful again, and need to move away from aligning with big money, need to move away from aligning with big business. And you've said before that they haven't really appealed to Republican voters. Well, they have appealed to Republicans, some moderate Republicans, some not so moderate Republicans like the Cheneys. I feel like that needs to change. I often get pushback for that, though, when talking to even, I would say, progressive friends of mine. In response, they use this argument saying, so you think the progressives will be the answer, but I think that they would actually alienate the center. I hear that all the time. And in response, I always say something that you have mentioned before, Nancy, which is I point to the 2016 Fox News town halls with Bernie Sanders, where he was actually getting applause by lifelong Republicans for speaking about universal healthcare, speaking about taxing the rich, speaking about breaking up monopolies, earning applause for that from people who you wouldn't expect it from if you were actually subscribing to this perspective of we can't lose the center. That's anecdotal, of course, but it does suggest to me that a charismatic leader, and you've said that before, Nancy, with a consistent track record on policy can actually transcend all those terms, can transcend progressivism, can transcend this communism label. Yet this really rarely resonates with people. You might also argue or throw back at them, well, maybe staying silent on Palestinian rights, maybe staying silent on fracking can also cost you votes on the other side, on the left side of you. But be that as it may, what's your take on this idea that we can't afford to alienate the center, Nancy?
Well, Trump didn't care about it, and it didn't seem to hurt his victory. This is a kind of self-disarmament, you might say. The right wing doesn't care at all about that, and it is actually growing and gaining votes. The center, this is such a vague concept. I think what the Dems meant, apart from, yes, the Cheney family, I think what they meant were suburban women. And it turned out they were basically counting on fear of Trump plus abortion. Abortion is, the referenda did quite well in all but 2 or 3 states. So that remains an immensely popular issue. But for the moment, it's no longer really a national issue. It's a state by state issue. So people could vote for a pro-choice amendment in their state and vote for Trump. And these are not even in contradiction in a very direct way today. And then you have to look at the losses. Harris lost 8.5 million. She got 8.5 million less votes than Biden got in 2020. They weren't all suburban women. There were many. She won the Latino vote in the U.S. She got some significant voting strength among Black men. And of course, the continuing bleed of working class votes, white working class votes, that is. So Trump got 1.5 million more votes than he got in the last election. That's an improvement. But she lost 8.5 million. So I think the question is her loss, what you lose on that side. And you had asked earlier about, what kind of new coalition might be possible. Look, a lot has changed since 2016, but when I analyzed that election, what is that, 8 years ago, I proposed a strategy of trying to peel away the sort of potentially, I'm using this in my special sense, the potentially pro-working class, or if you like, working families segment, which is a large segment of the Democratic vote. Not everyone in the party is a professional, educated professional. Peel them away on one side and peel away some significant chunk of people who vote for Trump on the other side. If you start out by assuming that they're deplorable and forever unreachable, then we should just pack up and go home. That's the end, game over. We have to start from the assumption that a chunk of them can be won away from that. Years ago, I talked about people who were opportunistic racists as opposed to principled racists. These are people who, okay, they're not so, worried about racism that they won't vote for a racist, but you give them a credible, non-racist populist alternative, a left populist alternative, and they'll vote for that. So I don't think the center in a country as polarized as we are in the U.S., the strategy of moving to the center is a failed strategy, and we saw it crystal clear now.
Jane, I want to ask you about that Guardian article that you wrote in 2021 again, because you said something else in there that I found very intriguing, because you suggested that the British Labour Party might be, and I quote you here, in a stronger position than many of its European sister parties to achieve future success. Fast forward to May of this year, and Labour secured a landslide victory after, I think, 14 years of the Conservatives ruling in the UK. Reflecting on that analysis, what led you actually to make that prediction or that analysis? And looking ahead, what lessons do you think US Democrats can draw from Labour's strategy and approach?
I think it's tricky to know exactly what lessons to draw right now, because Labor was on the sort of flip side of this anti-incumbency wave of the current moment, and they really did have a fairly ramshackle set of opponents going into this election. The British Conservative Party had completely run out of steam, and they'd run on since initially convinced the population to move on to a sort of a pro-austerity approach. And as the real consequences of that began to be felt, the Brexit issue came up, and that mobilized a sort of second set of elections. And then the way that they dealt with COVID was so widely critiqued, and the country really hasn't grown in 14 years. And so there was a very strong anti-incumbent movement, and I think the Labour Party was able to capitalize on that. So I think that in some regards, Labour was successful. They played a very safe strategy. They certainly did not move to the left. They played a very safe strategy that was targeted at winning by mobilizing voters in marginal seats to ensure they got a large electoral majority. They are now actually in a position where they have a very big electoral majority, but they are still feeling quite vulnerable because many of these kind of headwinds around the sort of changing nature of the electorate, growth and so on, are still there. The reason Labour, though, was in a stronger position compared to European social democrats in the past is partly just the electoral system, the same as in the US, with fewer parties and more incentives for people to coordinate around just a few parties. It puts them in a better position. But also they had managed to mobilize a lot of young people, a lot of urban voters, and European social democrats just haven't. They've gotten extremely older voters. They've been hardly able to refresh among young people. They haven't been able to build out those ties. And so that puts them in a very difficult position. And I think if you had said even a decade ago, a lot of the kind of truths that political scientists had about politics in the left, you'd say turnout favors the left or demography favors the left. We don't really believe that anymore because it seems like turnout is actually now favoring the right in many contexts. Demography is absolutely not predicted. Younger people, including minorities and working class people, are not necessarily voting for the left. And so the left has to make the argument. And I agree with Nancy really on this. They have to make the argument to these groups. They can't assemble a coalition just like building blocks and pull it together and hope that it lasts. There has to be something that connects with people and pulls that forward. I think Labour is still finding its feet in that regard, but they're pretty much going to be the last ones left in Europe soon, with some exceptions in Spain and Denmark and so on. But there is a real challenge there to like how you solidify a real progressive coalition going forward that I think the party is still feeling its feet around.
I actually really liked what you just said because it spurred this realization in my head that it is true that this whole discussion about how demography is on the side of the left, of progressivism in general, almost seems over the past years, or at least the last 10 years of my life, to be this kind of like end of history argument where you're just like, well, we don't really have to do anything. It's just going to go our way anyways. Maybe that's also part of the reluctance to have any of your own positions on the center left that you really care about. What I'd really like to know from both of you is where you see the Democratic Party going from here. And I want to stick to the ship metaphor that I've mentioned earlier because I do like it. Is the ship burning, first of all? Can the crew be saved? Is there a chance for getting it on the right course? Or, Nancy, is it also maybe stuck in a storm that it can't weather at all and that it was never really built for?
I love the metaphor. It's fantastic. Look, the ship is not the right ship. The question, though, is, do you just burn it down and build a new one? Or do you do, like the Vienna Circle philosopher, Otto Neurath, you build the ship while you're out at sea, taking out one rotten plank and replace, while you're going. So this is like reform versus revolution almost. So, look, we can't really predict. You mentioned at the outset, Kai, that you know what Trump is going to do. I actually don't. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty about how this next presidential term is going to go. One possibility is just continued slow bleed. Another is some kind of Big Bang disaster. I would say Brexit plus COVID was the Big Bang disaster in the UK, and that really set things up beautifully for the Labour Party. I suppose if Trump really did put 11 million people in concentration camps and begin to deport them, that might be the kind of Big Bang disaster that would change things. I doubt he will really do that. The tariff situation, at one level, it evokes the possibility of a global trade war of the sort that led in the early 20th century to the Great Depression and into World War. But I'm not convinced that that's actually going to happen consistently because I don't think he will allow the stock market to collapse. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what will actually happen. We might be facing more of the slow bleed than the Big Bang disaster. And in that case, everything really does depend upon the capacity, the building a new party alignment. If that's really crucial. And I think it's important to learn from some, dare I say, positive things on the Trump side. RFK Jr., critique of the industrial food system. This is good. We never had anyone at FDA or HHS who would do that. Okay, the anti-vax stuff, not so good. But that's a good one.
Jane, what's your take on the potential future course of the Democratic Party?
So look, I think that one thing that social democrats, not saying that the Democratic Party is necessarily it's cut from social democratic cloth, really, but I do think one thing that sort of defines the project historically is a belief in reformism to some extent, in that you can't that heightening the contradictions is a very dangerous strategy because many people lose out along the way. So I think Democrats have to try and continue to win elections. So there does need to be this soul searching. There does need to be a repositioning and a real deep rethinking. But there also has to be a real fight to win back political power and use that in ways that improve people's lives. I think that's fundamental to a progressive project. So the question then is like how you do that. And I think there is a possibility that we could see more of the same kind of muddling through some kind of 2.0 version of what we have now. I think that there is some possibility of that. My guess would be that we'll see a much stronger economic populist rhetoric. That's probably the way to go, and that there'll be some coordination around that. But it really depends on, again, in the next few years, generating leaders within the party that can speak to people, that can start building out a vision that's more compelling, and that can really bring people together, I think, in a way to see something both more positive and more possible. And I think that I would agree, I think, with the sort of what Nancy had said earlier. This does require a much more fundamental critique and acknowledgement of the kind of deep rot of a lot of the American political economy. It just doesn't work for many people. There's an enormous amount of rent seeking. Its life expectancy amongst some groups is falling. The income inequality is through the roof. And so there's a really fundamental structural problems in the American political economy and elsewhere. And I think until there's some kind of ability to package that and come up with a set of policies that really will move towards a fairer and better system, that it's going to be very difficult, I think, to build out policies that people really see in their everyday lives as improving it. So that's a big challenge for the center left everywhere, but particularly in the US.
That's, I feel, a challenge that we're not going to solve today necessarily. I have to say I was super inspired by the conversation. The self-help group that I've created for myself really paid off, I have to say. And I'm inspired by your anger, Nancy. It's great I really feel like I'm not angry enough right now, because I think the anger just left me for a second because I was in shock still, but it's definitely going to come back. And Jane, thank you so much for the insights from the UK. Very interesting. Nancy Fraser and Jane Gingrich, thank you for taking the time.
My pleasure.
Thank you.